continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We talked a bit earlier in the week revisiting Trump's campaign video on what he plans to do to protect freedom of speech in this country. But combating the censorship industrial complex is a problem in the West writ large. For example, this admiral from the Royal Dutch Navy named Rob Bauer, who is NATO's chief of their military committee, at a recent confab, he had this to say about free speech and X and what Musk and Trump are doing.
It's a sensitive topic to talk about, to talk to our own people, in information towards our own people. Very quickly it becomes propaganda, and that has a reason. But the Russians talk to us, they lie, but they lie openly, so they lie also to their own people, but they don't care. We have sort of an agreement that we don't do that. So what we say publicly should be, our people will check it. There's a number of people in our nations that will basically check if the government says something. That's not necessarily the case in China and Russia. So in terms of disinformation and cyber attacks and all the things that are happening, influencing elections, I think it's a serious problem. And I think the use of social media is basically amplifying everything that is being done by bot factories, and I'm very much in favor of freedom of speech, but I'm not necessarily convinced that what Mr. Musk is doing on X is the right approach. I'm very much in favor of freedom of speech, but there is a lot of things on Twitter that is not helping our societies at all.
So what you're saying is you're very much in favor of free speech, but you're not very much in favor of free speech. That's what I heard. The censorship industrial complex, this is going to be a big fight. It needs to be rooted out in federal agencies that we've talked about for the last several years, as well as perhaps some difficult conversations again with NATO from President Trump about if not First Amendment protections like we have in other Western nations, then at least the same norms in favor of free speech, which are under assault in places throughout Western Civ. For more on the topic, we're pleased to be joined again by Mike Benz. He knows a little something about it. In fact, he's been educating much of the Western world about this over the last several years, including us. He's the executive director of the Foundation for Freedom Online. He's also a former State Department cyber expert. Mike, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah, quite a clip there, right?
Yeah, he's for free speech, except the speech that he deems unhelpful to society.
Well, that's the funny thing. You know, I think folks listening right now need to understand that this is not hypocrisy. It's strategy. This selective alternation between saying that you stand for free speech but then promoting censorship is because NATO loves free speech as a weapon to destabilize governments of countries they want to overthrow. And then they promote censorship to keep in power the regimes they want to keep in power. So free speech, for example, was a military instrument for NATO to overthrow the governments of Egypt and Tunisia during the Arab Spring. Mm-hmm. That's why they promoted free speech there. They promoted free speech in Russia. That's why 26 U.S. government-funded NGOs all threatened and condemned Russia when they considered banning Telegram. But then when Telegram led to too much free speech in Ukraine, suddenly our U.S. State Department-funded media all called for Telegram to be censored, and when Telegram failed to do the censorship, magically its founder got arrested, and then quickly, out on bail, made all the terms of services changes to give censorship powers effectively to these NATO rapid response units. But NATO has this very, very rich history in the censorship industry. It's perhaps the top dog in it, which a lot of people, I think, may find hard to believe at first. But this goes back to 2014 with the initial Ukraine affair, when the Western world effectively overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine, and then there was sort of a counter coup where the eastern half of the state broke away, did not respect the new Victoria Nuland-led government, and NATO basically freaked out that this counter coup happened and that $5 billion worth of U.S.-funded media and civil society funding was still not penetrating the hearts and minds of people in Crimea or eastern Ukraine. And so they declared a new military doctrine. At first it was called the Gerasimov Doctrine, changed its name to the Hybrid Warfare Doctrine. Now it's referred to as the Sharp Power Doctrine. But it came to be known colloquially at NATO as a doctrine called From Tanks to Tweets, which is that NATO needs to see war in a new way, that it's not about the tank-to-tank battle between the West and Russia or the West and China. It's about control over social media, because social media is the new media, and social media is what controls elections, and elections are what control the use of military by the elected commander-in-chief. And so the real way to win a war is through tweets rather than through tanks. Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, formally declared this doctrine in 2019. And we've been living under it ever since. NATO just this week gave out tens of millions of dollars in grants in their new Societal Resilience Fund. This is a military NATO grant program in order to finance social media censorship methods done in the name of making citizens psychologically resilient against misinformation. This is military control over the media.
This has to be something that is on Musk's radar in particular, given his experience in Brazil, where he, can make this clear that the United States shouldn't be, on the one hand, championing free speech domestically and then subsidizing censorship internationally.
Totally. I think he has ingested an incredible education in a very short period of time. I don't know where his head was at when he initially purchased Twitter, in terms of if he knew then what forces he was going to be having to confront just by simply trying to promote free speech. But I think, like in so many other things that he's done, he has kind of gotten a speed run education in the space. But now it sort of falls to the Trump administration in order to implement what needs to be done to take those forces on, which is going to be a hell of a dogfight.
So who else is going to be instrumental in this fight domestically within the Trump administration to deal with CISA and these other and outside agencies that are or organizations that are in part funded by government, NGOs, academic institutions, all the things that you documented in the Election Integrity Partnership cabal, for example? Give us your vision for or your recommendations in terms of how you think the Trump administration should conceive what they're up against and approach it.
Well, there's lots of different assets and levers in this. Obviously, there's the cabinet and all the different agencies that are involved. My foundation, FFO, next week is going to be releasing a comprehensive list of every single government censorship program, every single federal government agency and bureau within each agency that is currently running a internet censorship program or initiative, which we hope will be helpful for the American people to educate themselves about this. And interested policymakers can obviously take that into consideration in the policy formulation they do. So you have the cabinet level, then you've got the House, the Senate, and the courts. which all have important roles to play in taking this on. And we are going to need every single one of those as free speech advocates because of the size of the political forces on the other side of this, which go all the way up to major banks, major multinational corporations, to much of the U.S. and transatlantic military itself.
But would you say would you say like Kristi Noem at DHS and Tulsi Gabbard, the DNI, would be like two of the natural people that would need to take prominent roles?
Absolutely, but there's DOD. For example, you just played. We started this with the NATO clip. Well, the main liaison to DOD is the U.S. Pentagon. So that's going to fall to Pete Hegseth.
Yeah.
Who's going to have to at least use the power of the pen to end 25 different DARPA programs that are all dedicated to internet censorship. You mentioned DHS and the Election Integrity Partnership, EIP, from 2020. Well, half of the people involved in that were a part of something called this DARPA ISAT board, which was a U.S. Department of Defense sponsored internet censorship program. There's the Semantic Information Defender, which basically is a real-time Pentagon keyword map that creates a living database of online disinformation. And the entities that have been uploading to that have been busted, basically calling Trump a Russian puppet. So they just throw anything pro-Trump in there. Trump really was at I would say his generals were at war with him. And so when the DOD is allowed to build censorship programs and say that they're doing it to stop hostile foreign threats like Russia, but then they call their own commander-in-chief a Russian asset effectively, it gives them, if they're unchecked, the power to censor 100 million Americans under the banner that they're all effectively a counterintelligence threat because they're backing a Russian asset. So those are the sorts of dirty tricks involved here. But, a major one is also going to be the U.S. State Department. And Marco Rubio was just announced as the Secretary of State nominee for the Trump administration. I should note the clip that you started this with Rob Bauer at NATO, basically saying that he opposes Elon Musk and Donald Trump's policy preferences, free speech advocacy on X. That conference was an International Institute for Strategic Studies conference. That institution receives $1.2 million from the U.S. State Department. The U.S. taxpayers funded that meeting where NATO is openly plotting its resistance to the First Amendment of the United States. So none of this would exist without government funding. Mm-hmm. And there is an open question as to whether or not a Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is on effectively the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and also on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, also just won an award 5 months ago from the International Republican Institute, the John McCain Award. This is a longtime CIA cutout. Marco Rubio is a guy who has sort of a foot in both worlds in terms of Trump world and blob world, and I think everyone's rooting for him and hoping that he does the right thing. But the fact is that blob side of the network that he's attached to is who is responsible for all of this. And my concern is for him to take on the censorship industry, he will have to turn his back on allies, which have been his longtime friends, if he's not going to put a knife in the back of Trump. So he's between a rock and a hard place on this free speech issue, and he'll need to do the right thing, or else this whole thing could get derailed.
Well, that'll require careful monitoring of him then. Yes, very interesting.
Let's talk about what's going on in France right now. You recently tweeted about the Blob's prosecutor playbook when they're losing in the political process.
Yeah.
What's happening there?
Well, this is stock standard now. Whenever you have a populist political candidate who is winning in the polls, the foreign policy establishment back channels with the State Department, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the prosecution services in the country in order to find a pretense to arrest the populist party who's winning in order to preserve their foreign policy agenda. We saw this in Italy with the arrest of Matteo Salvini, and now the criminal charges facing Giorgia Meloni. We saw this with the Vox party in Spain. We saw this with the AfD party in Germany. We saw this with Donald Trump in the United States. We saw this with Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's also under indictment in Brazil. All of these individuals were nationalist, populist politicians with a foreign policy vision that was diametrically opposite the longtime establishment NATO vision. And Marine Le Pen is the same way. You can tell whether or not you're going to get arrested running for president by simply what your elucidated foreign policy is. If Marine Le Pen, for example, has been running on a Make France Great Again, effectively, domestic policy, and she has strongly rejected the U.S. State Department's push for sanctions on Russia and for upscaling the NATO war to seize Eurasia. She has been running, for example, on restoring normal energy relations with Russia. Well, that would put France as one of the largest economies in Europe, the actual anchor of NATO. NATO didn't begin in Brussels. NATO began in Paris, and it was only after Charles de Gaulle effectively threatened to pull France out of NATO that there was a coup against Charles de Gaulle, and NATO moved to Brussels. But the fact is if Marine Le Pen were to successfully become the prime minister of France, it would be a dagger blow to NATO's plans to spend trillions of taxpayer dollars on across both sides of the Atlantic to expand NATO all the way to the outer orbit of Siberia, where $75 trillion worth of resources reside in Russia alone. There has been this long-term plan to seize Eurasia. The Ukraine geopolitics are just one phase of that. And if Russia is allowed to have normal diplomatic and economic relations with the West, then the whole plan gets foiled. So they need to stop her. They can't stop her in the polls. So they're stopping her with prosecutors, the same way they tried to do with Trump, the same way they did to Bolsonaro, the same way they did to Salvini. And it has totally corrupted the concept of a rule of law in the Western world.
Mike Benz, Executive Director of the Foundation for Freedom Online. Looking forward to that list of all the government agencies running censorship programs that's coming out next week, Foundation for Freedom Online. He's also a former State Department cyber expert, as you could tell. Mike Benz, thank you so much for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks. And you can follow me on X at Mike Benz Cyber. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
All right.
Just followed you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
So the body knows that it needs to heal itself, but it doesn't know how to concentrate it and target it into just one area. So that's where we come in.
By we, Dr. Ashley